epic promotional tour for Station 11. So I'd done, I think it was 127 events in 7 countries over 14 months. So, I'd go out on the road for a few weeks. I'd be back home for a while, then back out on the road. And the thing is, like, I actually really like touring, and I like doing events. You get to meet people who you wouldn't have met otherwise. And I like hanging out in bookstores. I'm going to say that probably 99% of the interactions that I have on tour are completely positive. People just want to connect with you about books, and it's really lovely. If you do 127 of those events, that 1% does add up. So I'd had a number of kind of strange experiences on tour. And I think by strange, I actually mostly mean sexist, just kind of like bizarre interactions. And I wanted to write about them. It was just, it's a very strange job sometimes. And it just seemed to me that I'd had kind of a weird experience. And I don't meet very many people who have my job and who've kind of been through that. And yeah, it seemed like an interesting thing to write about. So I'd started writing these fragments of autofiction, and I wasn't sure what I'd do with them. I kind of just saw it as an experiment in the form. I thought, well, maybe this will turn into something publishable someday, but maybe not. Maybe I'm just playing around here. And then the pandemic hit, and everything was awful. And I had this feeling like, you know what, I'm going to write a book about a time traveling detective. Just like I kind of always wanted to do a time travel narrative. And so then I had to pick my timelines. And, we can get into why I picked 1912 and 2020. But then when I started looking ahead to the future time points, I thought, would it be interesting to take those autofiction fragments and just kind of filter them through a sci-fi lens? So I've got these sections in the book about an author on tour for a book that seems a lot like Station 11, but she's going home to a moon colony at the end of the tour.
And then the novel is called Marienbad. And before we get into that, I do want to ask, because I'm sure listeners are wondering, you say, first of all, this tour for Station 11, how many countries again?
7.
And how many events?
127.
Okay. Very unusual. And I'm wondering, like like the 1% of interactions that are like sexist or disturbing in some way. Mm-hmm. Can you give an example?
Yeah, absolutely. Candidly, I put it all in the book. I've kept a journal all my life, so I had a verbatim record of those conversations. The woman in Texas who told me that I must have a very kind husband to look after our child while I do what I do. Which, it's just try to map that conversation onto a man on a business trip, and like it kind of bends your mind a little bit. All the people who asked me if I was sure that I'd written my book without a prescribed message for readers in mind. And the response is always like, well, I am actually the expert on Station 11 since I did write it. So yes, those moments. Or just the interactions that are not sexist. They were just kind of funny and off the wall. Somebody really did come up to me in a signing line once and open up a used copy of Station 11. And somebody, not me, had written in it. The message really was something like, "Dear Harold, I enjoyed last night. XOXO, Emily St. John Mandel." It's just like, wait, what?
Well, see, this is the thing. And this is, truly a surreal experience. And it is a rare experience for anybody writing. And we can get into the issue of categories, but literary speculative fiction or highbrow science fiction, whatever you want to call it, to have this kind of readership and to go from having written 3 books that were not widely read to suddenly publishing a book that is super widely read, and to be getting all of this feedback and to have this audience, some of whom have lines from your novel tattooed on their bodies.
Oh my God. That's extraordinary. That blows my mind every time I see it.
Yeah.
And you've actually just touched on why that tour was so long. I'd written these 3 small press books, which very few people had read. And then Station 11 was the book that completely changed my life. I never would have imagined anything like the kind of readership that it got. And when I started to see that it had some momentum behind it, when my budgeted 5-city tour turned into 11 cities and then 17, and then my UK publisher wanted me to come over, and then there were events in France, like just the way it started to build. I just had this feeling like this is my chance. This is the book that is going to completely change my career. So I just kind of said yes to everything until it got kind of crazy.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm curious to know about the sense of momentum that you developed. I mean, you just touched on it, but for most writers out there, an experience like this is foreign to them. And
Yeah.
so when things do start to tip and a book starts to catch a wave like Station 11 did, how, like specifically, how did it start to materialize? Do you start to get phone calls from your editor? Like, does your agent start to be like, hey, like, you're my favorite client? Like, what happens like materially to you where all
Yeah.
of a sudden it sort of carries, this thing sort of carries you away?
I have the world's most diplomatic agent. So if I were her favorite client, I'm sure she'd never tell me that. But I think that all authors who publish a book are kind of always looking for signs. Like, is there some clue about the way the market's behaving, or about the wording of emails from my editor, or about which publicist I've been assigned to, that like might make me understand kind of where I stand and how my book's doing. So it just kind of materialized as a series of really good signs, starting at the very beginning, which is that the book sold at auction, which is the most incredible thing. For so much of our lives as writers, or at least this has been my experience, there was such a long period of time, 3 books, where, the sort of vibe was, could somebody please read my book? You're always kind of selling yourself. The auction experience was like Alice in Wonderland, like stepping through the looking glass into this upside down world where editors were calling me to pitch themselves. As in, we think that Knopf would be the best possible fit for this book for the following reasons. So that was just the most incredible thing. So, yeah, so that was a really good sign. But a lot of books sell at auction and then go nowhere. The next really amazing thing that happened was there's this program in Penguin Random House called Tidal Wave, where the combined sales force of Penguin Random House will get behind just a couple of titles in a given season and just put all their weight behind it. And it's like this big campaign. So when I found out that Station 11 was a Tidal Wave pick, that was a really big deal.
Wait,
I think
I've
that
never heard of this
it's a
Tidal
really,
Wave.
I mean, it's an internal thing. So like, why would you? But it's a cool thing. It's a really cool program. And it's kind of across imprints. So yeah, so people in imprints who I'll never work with because I'm with Knopf and they're with, some section of Penguin. We're championing Station 11. That was kind of amazing. I think the thing that really tipped it over as far as momentum went was when it was nominated for a National Book Award, and that was extraordinary. That feels to me like the moment that completely changed my career. So yeah, it's a series of things, and then through all of that, I was working as an administrative assistant in a cancer research lab. I'm from a very working class background, by which I mean there's no safety net. So I held on to that day job for a really long time. And what clarified the question of what to do with that job was a conversation I had with a comedian. He said, well, the advice someone gave me was keep your day job until you can't afford to anymore. So I did that. I held on to that job until almost a year after Station 11 came out. And it got kind of crazy. Like there were days when I had to leave work early because I had like a photo shoot at Time magazine, like things like that. Or
Right.
there was this kind of long, surreal period where, as an administrative assistant, one of my duties was booking plane tickets for my boss. But I didn't book my own plane tickets. I had publicists who were doing that. So it was a
Right.
very strange time.
Like between worlds.
Between worlds, exactly. But it finally got to the point where I was too tired from doing the day job to do my events very well. And it just felt like I truly couldn't afford the day job anymore. So that was the most incredible material thing. I'd really always believed that I would always be an administrative assistant who wrote books on the side, and I was at peace with that. But yeah, when that momentum around Station 11 built up to the point where I could quit that job, that was incredible.
Yeah, it's got to be somewhat mysterious to you even. I mean, you think about the 3 previous books on smaller presses that did not take off, and then Station 11 suddenly sells at auction. Can you, with any degree of objectivity, look at Station 11 and discern what it was about it that might have given it the ride that it's gotten, or at least gotten it to auction versus the other books?
Yeah. I recognized as I was finishing the first draft that it might be a somewhat more commercial project than my previous books, which were kind of in the literary noir space, literary fiction, but with car chases and detectives. I think it was something about the post apocalyptic setting, but putting that in a narrative that was fundamentally hopeful. I wrote it with the idea that it was kind of the anti-Road, which I love The Road. I think it's a great book.
The Cormac
I'll
McCarthy
never read
novel.
it again. Yeah, exactly. You don't need to read it twice, but it's a great novel. I think the combination of it being post-apocalyptic, but also very hopeful, I think was part of it. I also do think there is an element of mystery here. And I don't mean this in a self-denigrating way at all. I believe in that book and I believe in my work. I also believe that there are writers at least as good as I am who don't ever get the readership that I found. And, that can be a little bit mysterious. It's, which 5 people were on the jury for the National Book Awards that year. Which reviewer was assigned your book, the New York Times, or, whatever the review was that might have pushed sales over. So yeah, it's there is some luck involved.
Do you ever struggle? Like, do you ever think, like, I mean, I was raised Catholic. I know from having researched that you were raised with no religion, so you probably don't have the guilt complex that I have. Have you ever been like, I'm not worthy, or feeling bad when you have writer friends who are really good, but who are still in that admin job or whatever it is? You know what I'm saying?
I do know what you're saying. I used to struggle with that a bit. And I've had to let go of that for my own sanity because I feel like there are no real answers and that it's not moral. It's just the marketplace. That's kind of how I see it. And that's kind of the only way I can understand my life. It's like I used to grapple with that. Why did I get so lucky with Station 11 when a lot of other very talented writers were not able to quit their day jobs? There isn't an answer. I know the book's good. I also know a lot of other books are good. And there are equally talented people out there who've had a harder time finding readers. What I came to eventually was you don't have to understand this life. You just have to live it. And yeah, I have at this point completely divorced myself from any kind of, I guess, any kind of moral trappings around that. So I don't feel guilty. I also don't feel like I'm incredibly special, or anything like that. My understanding of my life is that I write books that are able to find a wide readership, and that it's kind of market driven in a way. It's the good fortune of having the art that I create align with what people want to read, or that enough people want to read, that I don't have to have a day job.
Yeah. And then just some magical aspect. There is some, I feel like this, having talked to so many writers through the years. It's like I hear about tidal wave, and now that you say it, I might have heard that before in a previous conversation. But like that strikes me just as one example of like a lever, like a marketplace lever that like an actual human being can pull.
Yes,
Like,
exactly. Yeah.
like that lever was pulled on your behalf, and that's a tangible human identifiable break that you got.
Yeah.
And then the book goes out, and really though, that's where the rubber meets the road. Like actual readers have to read it, and there has to be a response that's generative of more readers. You know what I'm saying? Like how that happens and how the work itself speaks to the moment that it is in I feel like is something you cannot game as a
It
writer or a
it
publisher.
really, yeah, it really isn't. Um, there is so much luck involved, and it's I think some people don't want to acknowledge that because it feels like they're putting themselves down, and I don't mean it that way at all. I know the book's good, but I was very lucky at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's. I mean, it's both, right? Why
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
both be true?
yeah,
It
absolutely.
doesn't have to be a binary.
Yeah.
I'm wondering about the process of publishing Station 11, that sort of launching you to a new stratosphere as a writer, then publishing subsequent books, of which Sea of Tranquility is one. Uh, I'm wondering how it has impacted you to become more public facing, to become a quote unquote name author. And I guess like a related question, like, has it become harder? Like dealing with the expectations after Station, I know was difficult for you, right?
A little bit, yeah. This is approximately the least sympathetic problem in the entire world, which is why I don't talk about it much. But with
But
my,
it is human.
it's human and it is actually real. Yeah, with my first four books, like writing the first three novels and then writing Station 11, it's not like anybody aside from my reps were waiting with bated breath to see what was coming next. Like, I don't want to say nobody cared. I did have champions, and I'm forever grateful for independent booksellers in particular who really stood behind my work from the beginning. But yeah, there was not a huge crowd waiting to find out what I was writing. Um, for that reason, well, that was part of the reason I think why The Glass Hotel, my book right after Station 11, took as long as it did. That book was 5 years, which is not crazy. Donna Tartt's novels take a decade or longer. But my previous speed had been about 2.5 years to write a book. That's how long it took to write Station 11. There were other logistical issues. So I had a baby right after the Station 11 tour, and early parenthood, like that does not speed up your writing process. So
No.
that slowed down Glass Hotel. I also wasn't working on Glass Hotel for a while after Station 11 came out, just because I was always on the road. Like it took a really long time to have the time to focus on it. But also there was that weight of expectation, which I'd never had before. And it did feel, yeah, it did feel like a weight sometimes. And I'd log into Twitter and some total stranger would be like, time for Emily Mandel to write her next book. It's like, I'm working on it.
Yeah.
It's hard. Yeah.
Well, and it's also like the issue of reader expectation. Obviously, that's part of it. Like you're in a situation where you have a lot more people who are waiting for your next book. And so that can become kind of a mind fuck, I would imagine. It would for me. But then I think part of the equation that maybe doesn't get as much uh, attention is the kind of business side of things, like the obligation that I can imagine a writer feels to his publisher or her publisher, like, oh my God, like they're waiting for my next thing. I don't want to disappoint the people at Knopf who gave me the tidal wave the last time, all that kind of stuff. If you hand them a book that's like undercooked or is a stinker somehow, like, I can see how psychologically that would be part of it.
Yeah, that is part of it. I did feel this desperate desire to not disappoint anybody, which I hadn't really felt with the previous books because not that many people cared. Um, but yeah, it was this feeling like whatever follows Station 11 had better be good. I did feel that way the whole time I was writing The Glass Hotel. And that was part of why it took so long. With The Glass Hotel, it took me a really long time to figure out what the book even was. I ended up, the revisions on that book were so intense that I felt like I wrote 3 different versions of that novel. The structure was just kind of all over the place, and characters came and then were written out and written in again. And it was just really hard to find. What made it harder was that I sold The Glass Hotel as a partial, which I'd never done before. And just like for definitions, for anybody who's not familiar, that just means I sold it as a partial manuscript because Trump had just been elected. And I just had this feeling like, well, obviously the economy is about to collapse. So let me just get a book deal in under the wire. So I
Not
yeah, so
not
I
an unwise move.
No, no, I thought it seemed sound at the time. But what that meant was that when my publisher eventually read the first draft, that was their first time reading the book, which they'd bought, and it was pretty intense. I can laugh about it now, but the first round editorial notes were basically like, "We love this. Could you please change the structure, the plot, the characters, the pacing, like every element of the book?" So,
Right.
I did. I rewrote that book 3 times until it came together.
Okay. So I can understand how that would be disruptive emotionally
Hmm. Yeah.
at any stage of a writer's career. You don't have to be, you know, publishing in the wake of a big success like Station 11 to have that be difficult. At the same time, and in particular with respect to the success that you were coming off of, to have editors who cared enough to push back, you must appreciate that in hindsight, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. I have always been very intensely edited, both with a small press and with my current publishers. They're all big houses. It's Knopf in the US, Picador in the UK, and then HarperCollins in Canada. And I have an editor at each of those places. Yeah, they really edit me, which I really appreciate. It's sometimes hard in the moment, when I get these 9-page emails authored by 3 people, and it's just, yeah, just trying to make these massive changes to the book.
And
That can be.
I don't mean to interrupt, but
It's okay.
the question that pops into my head, having publishers in different territories, is that the editors work in conjunction with one another to give you
They
editorial
do.
feedback?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's kind of an unusual situation, but it goes back to how we sold Station 11, which is we auctioned it separately in every territory. So, yeah, so I went with Knopf in the US, and then I just really connected with Jennifer Lambert at HarperCollins Canada. So I went with her for Canada, and then with Sophie Jonathan at Picador in the UK. And I was a bit worried that it would be this kind of nightmare editing by committee scenario, but they're all really smart. And, so far their visions haven't clashed for any of the 3 books that I've done with them. But yeah, the notes are epic because it's 3 people and they all have a lot of ideas.
Well, it's interesting because I think something that I've read or heard through the years is that maybe when a writer achieves a certain level of commercial success, they actually get edited less
Hmm.
because they're just like, whatever, this person knows what they're doing. Let's just keep riding this gravy train, whatever it is.
Yeah.
I would, if that were to ever happen to me, I would feel nervous. I would want to feel like people were putting their best brain to the book and were really kind of pushing back against anything that they felt wasn't working or could be improved. I like the idea of being edited.
Yeah, absolutely. Because like we're not subjective about our own prose.
Oh,
You really, really need that an outside perspective on that. Yeah, I hope they never stop editing me. And I've heard the same thing. And I have noticed that writers who write series, that the subsequent books get longer and longer and longer. Um, and one might find oneself wishing for the perfect 300-page book within the 600-page book when that happens. I think, though, also there might be some element of urban legend, like urban publishing legend to this, because I have absolutely come across this sentiment on publishing Twitter where writers are like, editors don't edit anymore. And I always feel like, literally, what are you talking about? I am so edited, which is like you. That's how I want it. I want to be edited.
well, but I think the counter idea, the counter narrative to what we're discussing is that it might be the case that when there is more money on the line for the publisher and they feel like they stand to gain more if the book is really good, that they would care more and edit more, and that authors in whom they have invested less get less attention. That makes a lot of logical
Yeah,
sense to me.
yeah. I mean, that is possible. And I have to acknowledge I've had a pretty privileged experience here where with my first 3 books, it was a very small press. And my editor was great, Greg Michelson at Unbridled Books. He made all my books much better than they would have been. So I felt pretty intensely edited over there. I haven't had the experience of being with a big house where my book hasn't gotten attention. And I realize that makes me sound obnoxious, but that is just what happened. Because I did have that kind of lucky break with Station 11. So that is very possible. Yeah, that could be true.
So another aspect to the ride that you've been on since 2014 has to do with what I have in my notes here as creepy prophecy.
Look, there was always going to be another pandemic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But this is something that has been ascribed to you after Station 11, is that the book was somehow predictive of all that came afterwards in 2020 with COVID-19. And I should note for listeners that I am speaking with Emily St. John Mandel, and this would distinguish this interview from the hundreds that I'm sure you have done. I'm speaking to you as you are recovering from COVID-19, correct?
Yeah.
So
if
I
my
feel
voice
like
sounds a little weird, it's it's a little on the nose, I have to say, for my brand, but
just
here we are.
Another like meta layer to everything is that I'm talking to an author recovering from COVID-19 who wrote a book about a pandemic, and in Sea of Tranquility writes about an author who narrowly escapes a pandemic. I mean, we could go on, right?
It's like an infinite loop, isn't it? Yeah.
It really is.
Right.
So a couple of things. First of all, how you make sense of, I recognize that another pandemic was always going to happen, but just the closeness, the relative closeness between Station 11 and the COVID pandemic. And then I guess a related kind of question has to do with Sea of Tranquility and the sort of supernatural, supernatural, time travel-y, existence is a simulation sort of aspect.
Mm-hmm.
There's like a magical aspect to that, and I want us to discuss it as it pertains to your worldview, like your actual worldview and maybe lived experience. So first of all, the creepy prophecy.
Right. What's up with that?
You must get tons of feedback from press and from readers, and they must have you gotten this sense that they view you as some kind of prophet? That must be like a little bit strange.
It's really strange. Yeah. I get that all the time, especially on Twitter. And, you can say there was always going to be another pandemic till you're blue in the face. But to your point, those two things, Station 11 and the pandemic, were really close together. The pandemic in Station 11 was a little bit incidental to the plot. I just wanted to get to this post-technological world, and a pandemic seemed like a horribly efficient way to get there. It's kind of embarrassing, but, I traveled the U.S. giving a lecture about Station 11 and post-apocalyptic literature for years in between that promotional book tour and the outbreak of COVID-19. The lecture literally contained the line, "There will always be another pandemic." And yet I was totally blindsided by COVID-19. I didn't feel any more prepared than anybody else did. I was, frantically buying toilet paper along with the rest of us. It was, I don't know what to tell you. It was a weird experience. A lot of people wanted me to write about it, to write essays and op-eds about the experience of being the author of Station 11 in a real life pandemic. And I didn't want to do that, but the experience was weird enough that I did want to write about it, which is why it comes into play so much in Sea of Tranquility.
Yeah. Well, there's a line, I believe it's a line from Olive in Sea of Tranquility. If I have this wrong, forgive me, but the line is, quote, "My personal belief is that we turn to post-apocalyptic fiction not because we're drawn to disaster per se, but because we're drawn to what we imagine might come next. We long secretly for a world with less technology in it." And this speaks to what you just said about wanting to kind of get to the post-apocalyptic world with less technology in it. What's sort of the quickest way to get there in a dark way? And that was the pandemic.
It was. And also, like, full disclosure, that was a line from my Station 11 lecture, which I delivered all over the country. And then after March 2020, I didn't want to lecture about pandemics anymore. I felt very done. But that was good material. So I gave it to Olive. My fictional character delivers the lecture that I used to deliver.
I should note, too, that in prepping, I read, I think something from an interview where you said that you wondered whether or not you would be able to write a novel like Station 11 after becoming a mother. I thought that was an interesting insight. Like to write a book where 99% of the population is wiped out by a virus, and to have to think about that, especially in new motherhood, where you have this
Yeah.
infant child and
Mhm.
all of the responsibilities that entails, but also all of the questions about, have I made the right choice? I think most parents in the modern age have these kinds of inner debates. Did I do a wise thing? Am I ready for this? Is it, all those things. To then be living in an imaginative space day after day where a super virus comes in and, wipes most everybody out, that would be tough.
It was. I found those sections of Station 11 intensely difficult to write. And that was before I had a child. So what I found myself thinking was, well, if it was barely bearable then, I don't know that I could have done it after having a child, where, you know, I think parents live in a permanent state of terror, and you just kind of get used to it.
That's right.
Because if your child died, it would be the end of the world. And you just kind of learn to live with that over time. That's actually one of the many things that I admire about the HBO Max adaptation of Station 11, which is that I know all the people who worked on that show and their parents. So that they did live in that imaginative space in this world where, where they would, die psychically, like if anything happened to their kids. I don't think I could have written that book after becoming a mother, but there were people who were able to tell that story on TV after becoming parents. And I admired that. It's really not easy.
Well, interestingly, Station 11 really resonated during the pandemic, where I think there's one school of thought that might have it being like too much. Like people would be turned off by it. Like, I've got enough. I'm living it. I don't need it as a narrative in my life. But in fact, the opposite was true. People gravitated toward it and found comfort in it, right?
Yeah, I think that's fair to say for both the book and the series. I think a big part of that is you could look at it as a pandemic story, or you could look at it as a story about the way life continues after the pandemic. And there is a kind of inherent hope in that.
Yeah, for sure. And also, like, I think we, or I mean, as I say we, I know I turn to books for instruction, fiction or non. And there's something instructive about reading a story, however speculative or sci-fi or, imaginative it may be, that somehow speaks to the experience that we're living through and gets into it with depth, and maybe goes, and maybe importantly, goes beyond
Mm-hmm.
the real. Do you know what I'm saying? Like the
Yeah.
circumstances in Station go
Yeah.
beyond what we experience. They're much more intense. 99% of the population is wiped out, whereas COVID, the loss of life was still extraordinary, but was far less.
Yeah, which was kind of, it's been kind of a interesting experience comparing the way I thought a pandemic had to be versus like what it actually was. That was one of the things where, in retrospect, 99.9% of the population, that's overkill. You don't need to do that. It turns out that I don't know what we lost in this country, 2% of the population, which is a scenario more like The Leftovers, by the way, if you want to get literary about it. It turns out that's devastating, and that completely upends society. Just a very small number.
Well, when I think about, to kind of finish out the first part of this like magical aspect, the creepy prophecy question, I think there's some truth to the fact, or to the idea, that writers, certain writers anyway, can function as antennas or antennae. What's the plural?
I don't know how to pronounce it, but I can see the word in my head. I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
But you are somebody who is an astute watcher, an observer. I know that you grew up as a shy child and were sort of observational in temperament. And you're also a deep reader, as most good writers tend to be, and absorber of culture, or fan of culture. I imagine you're into good movies and TV the way that most creative people are.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense to me that certain people would become predictive in some way that we can't maybe even define, that you might be absorbing these things and you might be sensing certain things coming. like I want to say Kurt Vonnegut used to call writers canaries in the coal mine. Like we keel over first.
Yeah, right. That's an interesting idea.
Yeah, but I mean,
Yeah.
like I don't know exactly how it happens, and I don't want to make us sound too special, but it's just a function of the work that we do and maybe the way that we're wired. It makes some sense to me that you would have published Station 11 just a few years before COVID hit, that you might have sensed, like I think a lot of us have sensed this sort of coming apart of
Hmm.
our society, especially here in the States, maybe, just this feeling.
Yeah.
And then the climate, there's this sense of like our ecology being under great stress and when's the breaking point, maybe it manifested in you somehow. Like maybe your little antenna picked up enough signals that you were able to work on some subconscious level in a way that ended up being predictive, even though it was unintentional on your part to be so.
I mean, it's possible. If it's unintentional, I can't take credit for it. But um, yeah, perhaps it comes partly of just thinking about the consequences of how interconnected we all are now, which is, it took the Black Death 2 years to get from Italy to England. Now that's, I don't know, 3-hour flight, and it's been a while, but yeah, it's just everything happens so quickly now, and we're everywhere. And threats that used to be very different, very distant rather, epidemiologically speaking, are suddenly kind of right there. It's a few hours away. So
that's an
yeah,
interesting aspect.
yeah.
That's an interesting aspect to Sea of Tranquility and to Station 11 and to COVID-19 is the speed with which and the ghostly nature of a pandemic and its movement. The way it's very far away and then suddenly it's right in your face. Like that was one of the more destabilizing aspects of living through COVID, is that sort of getting these reports back in December of 2019 about Wuhan and about, you'd seen, like, I remember a friend and I trading YouTube videos taken in hospital waiting rooms. There were these weird, grainy, like terrifying videos. And my buddy and I were like, I think this could be really fucked up, like that sort of thing.
Yeah.
To suddenly it's like, the state of Washington I think that was where the first shutdowns happened. And, it just moved quickly.
I mean, the line in the book, which came straight out of my thinking in, New York City, March 2020, was pandemics arrive in retrospect, like in a way that's really unsettling, where one moment it's really far away, like Italy's in trouble, China's in trouble. Intellectually that you're in a city with multiple international airports. Like, obviously it's already here, but there was no testing available for so long. So then it somehow felt to me like it jumped from, this is a distant threat that's coming closer, to this has been here for a month and it's really bad and it's already too late to avoid catastrophe. And by the way, there are field hospitals in Central Park. It just,
right.
it happens so quickly that it feels retrospective.
It's so strange
that
we lived through all that. It feels like we're on some degree. I think we're on the other side of it now, right? Or to some degree, at least.
I think so. Yeah.
I mean, you're recovering from it and it's still out there, but it's obviously something we're living with now. But just the intensity of, spring of 2020 and into the following year. It almost feels like it happened to some other version of us or something, right? It's like
because we're all kind of traumatized and we don't want to talk about it. We've all been through this horrible thing that we're trying very hard to bury and pretend never happened. But it did happen. Like, we remember the refrigerated trucks outside the hospital morgues and like the horror of those moments, but it's kind of too much to process, so we're not. And I feel like that hasn't had a great effect on us as a society, that there is this weird kind of denialism, not wanting to think about it, not really wanting to talk about it. It's fine, don't worry about it. And it is kind of past us, but I keep meeting people with long COVID. So for so many of us, it's not. It's in our bloodstreams and our bodies. And it's, I think it's almost too traumatic to think about. And that's why we don't.
Yeah,
it's not healthy.
Similar to like the climate crisis, the way that people...
exactly.
Like, I think there's this sort of cavalier, almost like brazen courage or la-di-da-ness about people's anticipation of like massive climate disaster that isn't authentic. It's just like an emotional response to the issue being too terrifying. It's a process.
So in other words, it's like February 2020 in New York. when we were like, obviously the virus is already here, but we'll be fine. Whatever, we
We're
make
New
jokes
Yorkers.
about it.
We're New
We're New
Yorkers.
Yorkers. We can do anything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a similar kind of feeling to that.
So the second aspect of this magical question that I'm asking you has to do with a plot line in Sea of Tranquility related to time. This is, as you said, a time travel novel, and it also brings into play this question of what's it called? The simulation theory?
Simulation hypothesis.
The simulation hypothesis, which for listeners who might not be fully clued in, can you just tell us what that is?
Yeah, sure. It's what it sounds like. It's the idea that maybe all of us are living in a simulation. It's I came across it years ago on like one of those 1 a.m. Google rabbit holes. What I love about it is you can find very smart people who will very convincingly argue either side of that. I don't have a firm stance. I don't know if we're living in a simulation, but it was the only way to make a time travel narrative work, technically, which I can get into if you want.
No, because that's an interesting question, and I do want to discuss making a time travel novel work. But I like this idea of having that challenge presented to you and fusing the issue of time travel, like the narrative challenge of time travel, with the narrative challenge of we're living in a simulation. Like, it's one of those things that in retrospect is like such a logical leap. It's like, oh yeah, that would be a way to make it work. So kudos to you for finding it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's like the problem with time travel stories is they don't work. Like if you think about it for 5 minutes, it's like, well, if after this interview I step into a time machine that takes me back to 1950, was I not then always going to step into the time machine and back to 1950? It's like this infinite loop. And then also, how is all of human history not completely altered every time any traveler goes back in time? Like, it just doesn't really hold together. So I felt like the only way to make that work was to add this whole other level of weirdness, and that's the simulation hypothesis. And also what came into play is this idea that I've taken from TV writing called hanging a lantern on it. And the idea is, if you have something that almost but doesn't quite work, plot-wise particularly, you hang a lantern on it. Sometimes having a character point out the thing that isn't quite working can almost help, because it's like the character is an avatar for the skeptical reader. So that's why in Sea of Tranquility, there's a moment where we're in the year 2401, and there's a guy standing next to a time machine saying, we're not actually sure why this works. We don't know why the timeline seems to repair itself, as if the time traveler were never there every time we send somebody back. We think the fact that it works at all might be evidence that we're living in a simulation. So it was just the only way I could make that narrative work.
So I want to have you read now
Okay.
a small section from Sea of Tranquility that speaks to the simulation theory or the simulation hypothesis and some of the more magical aspects of the story that you're telling, and then we can discuss.
Okay, sure. I'm going to read a very short section from the first section of the book, which is set in 1912. To set this up a little bit, our character here is named Edwin, and he's a remittance man, which means he basically has a trust fund. The law in England at that time was that for families with an estate, like the entire estate had to go to the eldest son, which left kind of a surplus sons problem. And the solution that people used to come up with was, well, you send the sons to Canada or Australia and see if they can make a go of it there. So Edwin's the son of an earl. He's kind of stranded in British Columbia. He has no idea what he's doing, and he's totally unequipped for literally anything. And I'm going to pick up at a moment where he's on the beach, and a couple of Indigenous women are looking at him, and he feels kind of like unsettled because they don't respond to him at all. So he walks past them, and here's where I'm going to pick up. He keeps walking, and then at some distance, still feeling their eyes on his back and wishing to convey an impression of having some sort of important errand to attend to, he turns toward the wall of trees. He never goes into the forest because he's afraid of bears and cougars, but now it holds a strange appeal. He'll step in 100 paces, he decides, no more. Counting off 100 paces might calm him. Counting has always calmed him. And if he walks straight for the full 100, then surely he can't get lost. Getting lost is death. He can see that. No, this whole place is death. No, that's unfair. This place isn't death. This place is indifference. This place is utterly neutral on the question of whether he lives or dies. It doesn't care about his last name or where he went to school. It hasn't even noticed him. He feels somewhat deranged. The gates of the forest. The phrase comes immediately to mind, but Edwin's not sure where he picked it up. It sounds like something from a book he might have read as a boy. The trees here are old and enormous. It's like stepping into a cathedral, except the underbrush is so thick that he has to fight his way through. He stops a few paces in. He sees a maple tree just ahead, large enough that it's created its own clearing, and that seems like a pleasant destination. He'll walk to the maple tree, he decides. He'll step out of the underbrush and linger a moment. Then he'll go back to the beach immediately and never enter the forest again. This is an adventure, he tells himself, but it doesn't feel like an adventure. Mostly it feels like being slapped in the face with salal branches. He fights his way through to the maple. It's quiet here, and he has a sudden certainty that he's being watched. He turns, and there, as incongruous as an apparition, is a priest, standing no more than a dozen yards away. He's older than Edwin, perhaps in his early 30s, and has very short black hair. "Good morning," Edwin says. "Good morning," the priest says, "and forgive me, I didn't mean to startle you. I like to walk here on occasion." There's something about his accent that eludes Edwin. It's not quite British, but not quite anything else. He wonders if the man's from Newfoundland, like his landlady back in Halifax. "It does seem a peaceful destination," Edwin says. "Quite so. I won't intrude on your contemplation. I was just on my way back to the church. Perhaps you'll stop in later." "The church at Cayette? But you're not the usual priest," Edwin says. "I'm Roberts, filling in for Father Pike." "Edwin St. Andrew, pleased to meet you." "Likewise. Good day." The priest seems no more practiced at walking through underbrush than Edwin. He crashes away between the trees, and within minutes Edwin is alone again, gazing up at the branches. He steps forward into a flash of darkness, like sudden blindness or an eclipse. He has an impression of being in some vast interior, something like a train station or a cathedral, and there are notes of violin music, there are people around him, and then an incomprehensible sound. So that's a strange moment in a forest in 1912.
Yeah, and as a reader, and it happens early in the book, and as a reader, it delivers this great feeling of destabilization, like, whoa, like things just got weird.
Good.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to happen.
Yeah, no, and there's also some menace, and whenever you're in the forest and suddenly there's another person in the forest, and then it's a priest, it's like, okay, things are getting odd.
Yeah, that's weird. I wish I could do accents, by the way. I absolutely can't. But yeah, Edwin has this kind of upper class British accent, and the priest, who's not very good at his job, is trying to imitate that and like not quite doing it.
Right. So a question that I have for you is whether or not, I know that you were raised in British Columbia. We talked years ago. I mean,
I remember, yeah.
A long time ago.
A million years ago.
Way before Station 11.
Yeah.
And I remember we discussed your upbringing a little bit. You grew up on Denman Island in British Columbia, which I think is, obviously a similar territory that you're writing about here. And you had close contact with nature and were living in kind of a remote, like rural environment. I am wondering, and as we've discussed, you have this good antenna, if that's the way we can put it. Have you ever had any kind of supernatural experience of your own? Seen a ghost, been in the forest and felt something strange? Like, is it pure imagination and speculation here, or are you working from some more personal, deep sense of mystery or supernaturalness?
I've definitely been in the forest and felt something strange, but nothing that I could even recount, like just a feeling of like this strange feeling, like deep unease, like maybe somebody's watching me. And who knows if they were or not. Forests can make you kind of paranoid when you're out there by yourself. I've never seen a ghost. I did once take a really strange photograph, which I can post online with this interview if you want. I was trying to photograph this loft bed at an Upper West Side apartment that I was renting because I was trying to just like capture a picture of it for a subletter. And I was standing on top of the radiator, just like taking picture after picture with a digital camera. And there's one picture with a white transparent hooded figure in the lower left corner, and I don't know what's up with that. It's really creepy. It's not on the picture right before or the picture right after. Kind of looks like somebody was just dropping a towel that got blurred, but I was the only person in the room, and yeah, I can't explain that.
Wait, this was a film camera?
Digital camera.
Oh, because I was going to say maybe there would be like some superimposition
I
issue.
mean, yeah, who knows? Maybe it's a lens flare, but it sure looks like a translucent hooded figure just kind of floating around. It's creepy. Yeah, I have it on my phone. I'd be happy to put it online if you want. Yeah, so, I've definitely had a couple of weird experiences, but nothing like that. What that came out of was just this idea that I'd had for a very long time about moments somehow corrupting each other in time, or like spaces becoming corrupted in a way that makes no sense. I was thinking of it in terms of, suppose you have a computer on a desk in a room, and perhaps a couple of files on the computer somehow corrupt each other. Like, could happen. But on principle, the computer shouldn't be able to corrupt the wallpaper, and the wallpaper shouldn't be able to corrupt the lamp. And like, if things become corrupted that shouldn't, then that's evidence of some kind of weird simulation hypothesis moment. So I'd kind of had that idea in my head for a while. And that was what comes into play in the book, where that moment in the forest in 1912 is being corrupted by a different moment that's somewhere totally different in time and space.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. As I was reading with my writer hat on and thinking about the challenges presented by trying to write time travel, trying to write simulation hypothesis, trying to write well into the future or far back into the past. I mean, you've given yourself some pretty big challenges here. And so this moment that you read where Edwin is in the forest and he's at this maple tree and there's this kind of schism, between moments in time essentially manifesting. I think when I first read it, I was like, wow, how did Emily come up with this? But then it's like, if you're starting with the simulation hypothesis in mind, then you're looking for a way for it to manifest. I don't know. It's almost like it's an issue of sequencing for me. I figured it made a lot more sense to me once I realized I guess I should have realized that, but I guess like a question with regard to all of this is, how do you keep from getting overwhelmed? How do you give yourself these big tasks and then write your way into them and then render this stuff in a manner that feels authentic and acceptable to a reader? Because it'd be an easy thing to screw up. Like,
yeah, totally.
I mean, this guy in the forest looks up into a tree and there's a schism in time, and yet I, who am, I think, inherently skeptical, I was along for the ride. How did you do that?
Practice. It's my 6th book. That's really that's the honest answer. Yeah, you just have to be kind of reckless and just sort of throw yourself into the project. And anything for me personally, and everybody writes books differently, my first draft is always a disaster. So anything good comes about from just round after round after round of obsessive revision. And you do just get better at it, which I don't mean in an arrogant way. I just think you get better at anything. I think my 6th book is better than my 5th, and my 5th is better than my 4th, which is better than my 3rd, just because expertise develops over time.
You get better at making like those little micro choices.
I think so. Yeah. And for me personally, I'm also less scared than I used to be. Like, I used to be really scared about being taken seriously as a writer and like not writing anything too weird, and let's keep it kind of straightforward here. And that's really gone out the window with Sea of Tranquility, which it's partly just a product of the time in which it was written. There was this feeling when I started working on the book in earnest in March of 2020 in New York City of, you know what, the world is horrible. I'm just going to write whatever I want. I can throw an expletive or two in there. And I don't know that I would have written this crazy book about a time traveling detective who lives on a moon colony. If we weren't all kind of deranged in 2020, which we were.
Yeah, I mean, that's
Yeah.
interesting because as you were first saying all this, I was thinking of the word confidence. I was like, well, you're 6 books in, you've had this massive success with Station. You clearly know that you can do this and that readers are receptive. I would imagine it would give you a feeling of creative confidence to take a big swing. There's also a part of me that could be like, well, or maybe not, because you would feel more conservative because you don't want to disappoint people. But then you factor in the real life pandemic and how fucked up everything was in New York.
Yeah, we were beside ourselves.
Yeah, I think, I wrote a novel, the final draft of a novel during that same time period. And I often say somewhat sheepishly that it was a creatively liberating time.
It was. I had that experience. Yeah. Just like, fuck it. I'm going to write whatever I want. This time we're living in is appalling. And yeah, whatever.
Matter.
Who cares?
It doesn't
doesn't matter. Like, I'm writing about a time traveling detective. I'm just going for it. Yeah. There was a kind of creative recklessness for me.
But also, I think there's something you said that made me think, because I was like, oh, yeah, she's right. Like, it seems like maybe there were, like, time travel was sort of in the air creatively. Yeah. Like a lot of people's antennas were picking that up. Like, and maybe it had something to do with the awfulness or the appalling nature of the reality that we were living through.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I mean, Emma Straub just published a time travel novel. That is absolutely not her usual genre. I have this sort of on again, off again correspondence with another literary novelist who was like, "Oh, you're working on a time travel novel? That's so weird." Me too. And like, she's literary. That's not her thing, but just, pure third-hand anecdotal evidence. She knew 2 other writers who are writing time travel novels. There's that. I also wonder if there are going to be more kind of multiverse books, if there aren't already. Because isn't this an awful timeline? I mean, I don't know about you, but I think about that a lot. Like, we're not in a great timeline over here. So, perhaps there's an element of escapism in both those things.
I was going to say, like, if reality is so intense and awful, it makes sense to want to escape it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, get me out of here through time if necessary.
So, okay. So, to continue our conversation about writing you're giving yourself these difficult challenges, I think in particular writing into the future, because you have to invent stuff and imagine worlds, and you can kind of extrapolate from where we are currently and sort of use that to draw the scenes that you're writing. Whereas by contrast with the past, you can do research. You can look at old photographs or read old books, and you have source material to go by. But when you're writing in the year 2400, it's just up here. And so something I noted about the way that you do it on the page is that you're judicious about the inclusion of technology in the story, or like surface level or environmental details. What I found is that the realms that you're portraying, like these moon colonies, are not overloaded with sensory detail in the passages that depict them, but that there are key details that do a wonderful job of delivering me as a reader everything that I need. Correct? I mean, is that the way that you approached it?
Yeah, good. Yeah, that is how I approached it. I will just say, working on this book gave me like a whole new appreciation for historical fiction writers, because I think probably this varies just depending on how a person is temperamentally. I find the future so much easier than the past. It's like the past, you really want to get that right. Those are real historical details. The future, you can just kind of make it up. There's something liberating about that.
Right.
But yeah, I think what you've touched on is a decision that a writer has to make when you set out on a sci-fi or a speculative project, which is how deeply into the weeds you want to get with your futuristic technology. And
go ahead.
No, and it's like, you can go either way. Like I really love the Chinese novelist Cixin Liu, The Three Body Problem. He gets so deeply into futuristic technology in a way that shouldn't work but does. I find it really fascinating. I've kind of taken the opposite approach where, I don't describe how the time machine works because it's just transport. I don't describe how cars work either. I'm just getting you a character from point A to point B. And yeah, I think you can really go either way. I suppose that's the hard versus soft sci-fi divide.
Yeah, well, I think I appreciated it. I think there are certain, I mean, I'm not somebody who needs like a 5-page description of the tech. I'm so
Mhm.
unmechanical as a human being anyway that I probably wouldn't understand it.
I mean,
But
we're writers. It's like,
yeah,
yeah.
but I think also I noticed there were some moments in the book where you are judicious either with description or you're compressing time,
Mhm.
like in a narrative way that's very attuned to the readerly experience. It's good plot work, is what I would
Thank you.
say. Like, I forget exactly where it was. There was a section, or like the years that Gasperi spends training for time travel. There's like a 5 year.
Yeah. I think the transition is literally 5 years later, he reported to the time travel chamber.
It. I noted it. It's a paragraph that's about half
Right.
a page long,
Yeah.
and I was like, oh, see, I always have great admiration for time shifts when they're handled well in a narrative, because if they're not, they bring you right out of the story.
Yeah.
It feels too jarring, but you manage to, like, when it's done well. I think what it impresses me so much is that you can literally take readers through 5 years in a paragraph, and if it's done well, it's like, yeah, of course, 5 years later, here we are.
Right. Right. Thank you. I'm glad that worked.
Yeah.
Yeah. Velocity is really important. I was kind of experimenting with form a little bit in Sea of Tranquility, where it's a short novel, and I wanted it to be a short novel. I had this idea that I wanted it to be maybe even novella length, or like I think it's barely over a novella. It's only about 55,000 words. Um, yeah. So then anything extraneous has to be stripped away, and I really just want all my books to fly. Like I want to edit out everything extraneous.
Well, that's definitely, it felt that way. There's an elegance to the prose. There's also a really lovely clarity to it, which is so key in any book, but especially a book that takes on things like time travel and simulation hypothesis, where you've got to keep people, and you're jumping around in time so much, and you have
Yeah.
different plot lines and different characters. It's a big set of responsibilities, and there's a lucidity to the writing that's really admirable. And I
Thank
mean,
you.
if I can read it and not get lost, then you have won, because I get lost so easily usually. So
Oh no.
I'm
Sorry to
easy
hear
to,
that.
yeah, I'm easy to lose. So I want to talk to you before I let you go about the multiverse. Is that a way of putting it? That you're sort of creating across all of your fiction,
Yeah.
or at least all of your recent fiction?
Yeah.
Uh, I love when writers do this. It's like you're creating an entire universe where characters cross over from book to book and plot line to plot line. And in one book, they might intersect with a new character, or they might intersect with a character from an old book that they didn't intersect with in that book, all that kind of stuff. Can you just talk a little bit about that impulse in you creatively?
Yeah, sure. I think I might have just a kind of longing for order in the universe. It's nice to kind of pull these projects together and think about how they might be part of some kind of massive whole. Often it's just a matter of falling in love with particular characters. I really liked Miranda in Station 11, and that's why I brought her back in the Glass Hotel. I really liked Clark too, but I haven't figured out how to bring him back yet. Um, and then when I was writing Sea of Tranquility, I realized that I wanted to have a 2020 section because, we touched lightly earlier on the month of February 2020 in New York. I'm obsessed with that month. Just that kind of mass failure of imagination where we absolutely knew what was coming. We're not idiots, but we somehow didn't quite believe it was coming on some emotional level. Therefore, we were totally unprepared. It's kind of fascinating to me. And yeah, so I knew I wanted to write about that even in March 2020, like a month later. So I realized as I was thinking about that I had this whole cast of characters from the Glass Hotel, which I had just published, just kind of like waiting in the wings. And because, we were just talking about velocity. Because that's one of my core values as a writer, I can't spend that much time on secondary characters, even if they're really interesting. So in Glass Hotel, I really liked the character of Morella, Vincent's best friend. But I couldn't spend that much time with her because she was not a main character. But I could bring her into Sea of Tranquility and just get more of her, different aspects of her life. So sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's fun to just build in weird little connections. Like in my third novel, The Lola Quartet, one of the characters is obsessed with this obscure band called Baltica, which we spend a lot of time with in the Glass Hotel. Jonathan Alcaides makes a passing entry in The Lola Quartet, and then is a major part of the Glass Hotel and a small part of Sea of Tranquility. There's a minor character in The Singer's Gun who's also a minor character in Station 11. It's just fun to build a cinematic universe.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, a nod toward this greater theme that I think connects all of your work and animates you like personally and creatively, which is that everything's connected, and in ways that we might not even possibly imagine. And so every writer who publishes multiple books is creating a body of work, and that body of work, one way or another, is a unified body of work in some sense. And I think you're just, maybe by doing this, recognizing it or being more honest about it, right?
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's fun to do. I enjoy it.
So before I let you go, I know in the first conversation that we had, years and years ago, we talked more about your upbringing and, you were homeschooled until 15. Mm-hmm. I think we got into all that. I did not listen to our last conversation before this one. So it's been a while. I'm guessing that we got into that. So I'm not going to.
We must have, because there wasn't that much work to talk about. If it was The Singer's Gun, that was like 2010.
It was, was it the Lola Quartet? It was something like that.
Okay, right.
I do know also that you, in your youth and into, I think, your early adulthood, were a dancer.
I was, yeah.
Like modern dance?
Yeah, trained in ballet and then switched over to modern because ballet is basically impossible.
Yeah, but the point is, like, you were into it. Like, it was not.
I was into it.
It was not a hobby.
No, that's what I went to school for.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm always fascinated when I'm talking with a writer who is what I would call like a hybrid. Sometimes it'll be a writer who is like a rock musician or painter, whatever it is. If you can look back on your time studying dance and working as a dancer and draw any lines to your career as a writer in ways that it has informed it, like, are there things you learned as a dancer that have carried over? How did it influence the work that you do writing fiction?
I think the major influence had to do with work habits and discipline, where it just takes the most inhuman discipline to be a dancer. That is a really hard life, and like, you really got to love it. And it just takes so much discipline. So I think that having been a dancer made me a more disciplined writer, and probably would have made me a more disciplined teacher, attorney, or whatever other thing I could have done, if I hadn't started writing. I think also this was something I thought about more with my first 3 books, when that was more the kind of career where, you do the event at the independent bookstore and one person shows up, or, you're just like begging anybody to read you. And it can feel like a hard life. Like there were definitely tours around that time where, it was like 6 hours on a Greyhound from the South up to some other part of the South, and like creepy airport hotels, which you choose because they're $67 a night, like that kind of tour. That can feel pretty hard and pretty demoralizing. And something I used to think about back then was, this is really hard, but it's easier than going to an audition. And I have retained that a little bit, even though my career is easier now because there are more readers, where, my worst day as a writer is still better than being in the audition room, which just being like one of 200 women in skin tight clothes with a number pinned to my chest competing for one job. Like, I don't have to do that anymore. So I think there's something about the dance life being so hard that it makes other careers seem easy.
Well, yeah, not only that, like aspect of it, like the physical, like the judgment, right? Like you're being judged. It's like
exactly.
it's almost like a livestock. I was thinking of like a livestock auction or something.
It can feel that way. And also just the physical risk of it, where, if I blow out my knee tomorrow, I'll still be a writer. Dance is so precarious, just in how dependent you are on the body.
That was the second part of my thought, was like, it's physically punishing. It's not just like the discipline of having to like go out to those auditions and practice, but ballet, modern dance, like it is painful.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
By contrast, like writing might be like psychically painful.
And like my neck's screwed up, but I have a standing desk, so it's fine.
It's nothing. It's
nothing compared to dance. Yeah.
So are you working on anything new? I know we're on paperback for Sea of Tranquility. I always ask writers if they've got something cooking. I have to believe you've got something going.
Yeah. I'm working on a new novel. It's I'm only halfway through the first draft, so it's going to be a while till it's done. It's another kind of multiverse situation, which has been kind of fun. The protagonist of the new novel is the villain from my second novel, The Singer's Gun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So did it begin as most of your books begin, with like an attempt at, like, it's like this attempt at literary fiction that then kind of morphs into maybe something that's like a hybrid form of literary fiction with science fiction? I mean, if it's a multiverse novel, right? But I love this idea of your creative process being super generative and ultimately successful, but that the roots of it are always like a failed attempt.
Right. Yeah.
That's
the
instructive.
Roots are always chaos.
Yeah.
It came out of some crazy idea I had that was sort of multiverse related, which I don't want to give away the plot because I haven't figured out what it is yet. I don't know what it'll be. It's such a weird book. I've been working on that. I've also been working on a feature film adaptation of my first novel, Last Night in Montreal, with my friend Semi Cellist, who I kind of met through screenwriting. And that's been really fun too. I really love that form.
Great. Well, I appreciate the time. I know you've done a million interviews, so I hope this in some way distinguished itself in a small way from the others that you've done. I also appreciate your willingness to talk with me through like a post-COVID laryngitis situation. It sounded great.
Thank
it worked.
Good.
So appreciate it, and best of luck to you on all that you have going.
Thank you so much. It's a great interview.